Welcome, guys, to Academic Literacy 2. So basically, we are doing lesson recaps for week 9, week 10, and week 11. So we're going to cover all the contents that we covered in week 9, week 10, and week 11. Okay. So basically, we're going to look at language, imagery, and communication and why this is important in media studies. Okay. So language, imagery, and communication form an important part of how the media projects messages, provides the public with information. So we are looking at how the media produces information and how it utilizes language, imagery, and communication to form an important part of how we, the audience, project those messages. Okay, and how the media also provides the public with the information or advertises products. For instance, let's look at advertisements. When they are on the radio, in a magazine, or on television, they use different techniques to communicate the message that they are trying to convey to the target market or target audience. And many of these techniques involve a clever use of language, sound, and image. So they create a very good creative language, sound, imagery, or motion, just to make sure that we get the message that they are trying to sell to us. Okay. Now, the primary characteristic of media discourse is that the variety of different media and the equally expansive set of ways that each type of media reaches its audience. If we look at different types of media in contemporary society, in our modern society, in the 21st century, look at books, magazines, radio, the internet, television, and so forth. Each one speaks to the public with a different voice. For instance, TV can host a different programs, ranging from fictional television shows to the daily news. What now ties all these discourses together is that all media discourse talks about social reality in some way. It follows then that because social reality is always growing and changing, the way the media talks about it will grow around change too. Now, what is the primary characteristic of media discourse? Okay, let's look at that now for a second. The primary characteristic of media discourse is the variety of different media and the equally expansive set of ways that each type of media reaches its audience. Now, let's look at another thing that you need to notice about the term media discourse. Media discourse is that the word discourse itself, it implies conversation or a back and forth exchange of information. That's your discourse. This is because the media shapes the world around it, and it also shaped by the world in which it is created. The conversation that happens between the media and the world occurs through language. That is your text or spoken language, and imagery that is either moving or static. Now, let's understand how the media works, and let's look at theories that explains how the media ought to work. Now, we're going to start looking at structuralism and post-structuralism. Structuralism in the 20th century, it was a movement of philosophers, linguistics, and scholars in the range of other fields who believe that human culture can be understood by studying the relationship between human beings and an overarching structure or system. Structuralism works to uncover the systems and structures that coordinate, regulate, and underline all human interactions, such as how human beings think, feel, create, and navigate social reality. In linguistics and semiotics, we have one scholar, Ferdinand de Saussure, who developed a structuralist approach to understand the way the language works in society. He wanted to understand, how does language work in society, in any given society? Now, his analysis focused on how language, which he termed parole or speech, is used by rather or an underlying system of language. which he called language. Now, Sasson's theories will go on to influence many semioticians to follow, such as Roman Jacobson, who also adopted a structuralist approach to his theories of communication. Then we also have Charles Sanders, working on the same time as Sassoon, contributed a triadic, which means like a three-part approach to structuralist semiotics, which in many ways expanded on Sasson's initial diachronic or two-part approach. Roland Barthes contributes to structuralism through his theories of the myths, denotation, and connotation. He also, however, moves between structuralism and post-structuralism. Now, if we move to the 20th century now, structuralism, it is a 20th century movement of philosophers that we need to understand. Okay, now when they were looking at semiotics, for example, they analyzed how media text is discussed, argued, in the whole exploration of media discourses. So semiotic analysis of media text. Believe it is difficult to imagine a world without the media. Just think of the world without the media, without newspapers, without television, without radio, without social media, without your Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. Media impacts everyday life. It constructs and is constructed by it as well. So media impacts life, and life also impacts media. The term media, it refers to a number of things, such as, but not limited to these: television, radio, print media, you look at magazines and newspapers; new media, look at the internet, film, advertising, and so forth. Elliot Gaines said, since the earlier days of mass communication, media have influenced social discourses about the issues of the day. When print was the dominant medium, newspapers, when they were dominant in the past, whoever owned a printing press had a great deal of power to influence the attitudes, beliefs, and actions of those who were able to receive what was being circulated at that particular time. As new media develop, audience adapt as well. Definitely, people change also with time. With new technology, people adapt to understand what's going on at that particular time. While individuals also have always been occupied with their own affairs, society foresees collective issues into our everyday lives. And these collective issues can take different forms, but they largely appeal to the things that are particular society recognized collectively. For example, in contemporary society, there is a recent and increased awareness of the politics surrounding gender and sexuality. There are so many other examples that you might analyze, that you might look at as well. It's not limited to gender and sexuality only. Media have responded to this by becoming more inclusive in their representation of queer and female characters. For example, the popular fictional television series Orange is the new Black, has lesbian, and transgender characters. This is a good example. It also shows us how the world is changing as well. Transgender women have started to feature in fashion, beauty campaigns that were previously the domain of cisgender women, those whose gender identity corresponds to the sex that were assigned at birth, such as male or female. You are either a male or a female. Then we have reality shows like Queer Ear, which discuss issues that are important to the queer community while providing fashion, lifestyle advice. We have so many. These are reality shows, for example, with the RuPaul Drag Race, that showcases the talents and skills of drag queens, which also increases queer visibility and challenging gender norms. Media are Therefore, in all forms, types of mass communication that are able to reach a large audience, the term communication is particularly important. It is key. It is fundamental, as it refers back to the idea of media as a dialectical. The term dialectical, putly simply, refers to a reasonable, rational discussion of something or an exchange of ideas. What we see here is the recurrence of terms like communication, discussion, and conversation, always that imply an exchange that we associate with language and expression. Therefore, in essence, media communicates with society through language. It may be written, read, spoken, or heard. And we have also the images seen or understood by the society. If we analyze Roman Jacobson's semiotic theory of communication, when considering the process of communication, Jacobson says that, I quote, "We must constantly take into account the decisive difference between communication, which implies a real or alleged addressor, and information whose source cannot be viewed as an addressor by the interpreter of the indications obtained," I close quote. In other words, Jacobson's analysis of how we communicate tells us that verbal discourses goes far beyond the simple exchange of information between a speaker and a listener. It involves determining who says what, to whom, where, and when it is said, and how and why it was said. Interesting it is. Roman went on to say, the information or message that is being conveyed by the speaker or by a speaker, and the way in which this information or message is received and interpreted by the listener is shaped by a number of different factors, such as the setting or context in which the exchange is taking place, the content of the message itself, the participants in the verbal exchange, and the goals or intentions of each person involved in the exchange. These are key things that determine how a message is conveyed and how we understand the message as well. 6 factors of communication and functions of language. This is what Jacobson argued, that any type of verbal communication is comprised of 6 elements and 6 corresponding factors. The first being the context. This basically refers to the world or space in which the conversation or verbal exchange takes place. That's your context. The second is an addressee. The addressee is the communicator, the person speaking. That's your addressee. Third is the addressee. Before the addressor, the third is the addressee who receives the communication. Fourth is the contact that is made between the addressor and the addressee. Fifth is the code, or the common code that allows the communication to be understood or received in the way that is intended. Then finally, sixth is the message, that which you are sending out, or rather the content of the communication that is being passed between the addressor and the addressee. So these 6 components of languages, to put it differently, all communication can be characterized by an addressor who initiates the communication. There is a message that they want to convey to the addressee, who is the intended receiver of the message. The message is conveyed within a context that provides the tools that the addressee needs to decode, encode, and understand the message. For example, the phrase, "help me," could have different meaning depending on whether the addressee is dangling off the edge of a cliff in danger or simply needs assistance in carrying their groceries. So a mode of contact needs to be established in which the message is delivered between the addressee and the addresser. And finally, a code provides the signs of encoding and decoding the message. Like I explained before, the 6 components is argued by Robertson of language. We have addresser, message, you have the code, you have the addressee, the contact, and context. Now, let's look at Ferdinand de Saussure, who was analyzing semiotics. This is what he thought semiotics is built upon. Human beings are homo significans. This means that we are meaning makers driven by a need to make meaning out of our surroundings. In doing so, we form an understanding of our world. So Ferdinand argues that we make meaning through our engagement with and interpretation of signs. He provides us with a didactic 2-part model of what constitutes a sign. In his model, as you can look at the screen there, a sign is a word made up of 2 parts, the signifier and the signified. The sign as a whole is created by the association between the signifier and the signified. As you can see on the screen, Ferdinand diagram, the relationship between signifier and signified is called signification and is represented by arrows pointing to both up and down. And that line separates the 2 elements of the sign is called the bar. As you can look at the screen there, we have the signified, the arrow pointing down, then the signifier pointing up. And the line that separates the 2 is called the bar. A sign must consist of both a signifier and a signified. For example, when someone comes across with the word open in a shop window, they invest it with meaning because it is a sign that consists of the following: a signifier, the word open; a signified concept, the shop is open for business. The signified helps us to interpret the signifier. The word, for example, open in another context, such as on the top of a box of a cereal, will have a different meaning, definitely. A signifier, the word open, a signified concept. This is where and how you should open the box of cereal. So the signifier and the signified, this is where all key interpretation takes place. Then we also have signifiers. The signifier is the second image, the word or the visual aid that make us part of a sign. A signifier can be seen as a visual text or an image, or heard as a sound image, such as spoken words. For example, if someone says the word stop, or if we read the word stop, or on a street sign, we identify and understand it as a signifier that means that we should stop. Hence, a word is made up of a number of letters. By interpreting these letters as a word, meaning is created. Signified. Let's look at signified and explain. The signified is the concept, idea, or meaning that we interpret from the signifier. When we hear or read the word stop, for example, we attach meaning to it. We understand that the word stop means that we should stop moving. However, the signified is not stable. The interpretation of the signifier is internal to the person who is interpreting it. What does that mean? How we interpret the signifier is often affected by different people in different contexts. If we return to the word open, the meaning of the word changes in different contexts. It can be both an indication that a shop is open for business or an instruction on how to open something. Then we have the referent. The referent is the person or thing to which a name, linguistical expression, visual representation, or other symbol refers. For example, the word cat is not a cat, but rather it is a word that means a cat. A drawing or photography of a cat is not a cat, but rather a visual representation of a cat. When we read here, see a visual representation of the signifier cat, we associate it with our understanding of what a cat is, which is a signified. The referent is the actual cat. That is a cat that exists in the material world. Then the arbitrary nature of signs that we need to understand, just as like Soso tells us that the sign is composed of two parts. So a sign has two parts, the word or sound image and the signified, which is the concept. So before Soso, semioticians believed that language was made up of bonds between the word and its meaning. Then Ferdinand argues that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. This means that the relationship between the thing, word or sound image, and its meaning or concept is random rather than based on any reason or system. So Sasso's concept of the sign, it tells us that language is independent in relation to reality. In this sense, language can no longer be understood through the study of linguistics origins, or through the study of structure, historical development, and relationships of language or languages. Rather, it can be understood through a study of how language states, the state of language at any given point in time. In other words, we are bound by the need to use language in a socially accepted way, which means at a way that is acceptable according to our time and place. Where are we? What are we doing? What are the circumstances? Otherwise, we will not be understood. Now, if we look at South Africa and culture, this is a diverse nation with different cultures, different languages, rich, which Desmond Tutu believes it's a rainbow nation because of different cultural heritages that we have. South Africa is a culturally diverse and dynamic country with a rich and complex history. Culture therefore plays an undeniably important role in South African society. Culture shapes the way that people think about society. It molds their opinions, attitudes, and behavior. Moreover, culture brings people meaning and influences the development of their identities and political views. It encompasses people's day-to-day activities and practices. So now, the mid to late 1990s saw a radical political shift that changed the way society was structured in South Africa. Apartheid came to an end, and the first democratic election took place. Worldwide, this was also a period defined by increased globalization, and advances in technology. Together with these changes, new ways of understanding the world emerged. Of course, because now there was new advances, new technology, globalization was on the rise as well. So definitely, people are going to understand the world in a different way. This would have profound effect on the media and the ways that the media relates to the context in which it is created, disseminated, and consumed. If we look at the history of cultural studies now, academics tend to disagree what the field of cultural studies actually is. Although the field of cultural studies is relatively new, it is not the first attempt to understand human culture. For example, disciplines such as anthropology and sociology have traditionally focused on the influence of culture on social structures in communities. Cultural studies draws on elements of different disciplines, including but not limited to sociology, anthropology, to formulate its theories. Now, let's look at decoding and evolution of influences. Cultural studies is a field of analysis that focuses on potential and social dynamic of contemporary culture. It attempts to define the characteristics of contemporary culture and determine its historical foundations. Researchers in cultural studies examine how cultural practices are linked to wider systems of power and categories such as race, class, and gender. Cultural theories combine different political-oriented approaches, including post-colonial studies, critical race theories, feminist theory, postmodernist studies, and post-structuralism. Cultural studies considers social practice in order to understand how and why we adopt certain trends or ideas and reject others. Why we gravitate towards certain groups and shy away from others, and how or why we perform our roles in society. It questions that. Then we have a decoding and evolution of influences. In order to understand, for example, subcultures in South Africa, it is necessary that we understand more about some of the key theories in cultural studies. The theoretical movements that we are going to focus on now that are post-colonialism, postmodernism, post-culturalism, and post-feminism. I'm sure now you have noticed that all these terms, they start with post. This implies that these theoretical movements were created in response to what came before. So the prefix post in post-colonialism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, and post-feminism suggest a new perspectives on old ideas. In addition, it is worth considering that all these movements formed in globalized and technologically oriented world where the lines between continents, cultures, and societies have been increasingly blurred. Now, let's look at post-colonialism. Post-colonialism refers broadly to the period following Western colonialism. It is important to draw a distinction between post-colonialism period as a temporal aftermath of the colonial period. A post-colonial theory is a critical aftermath. A temporary aftermath refers to an identifiable time period which begins when a previously colonized country is liberated from colonial rule. South Africa, 1994. Zimbabwe 1980. You might think of any other African countries as well: Namibia, Botswana, Ghana, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, all these countries. So a critical aftermath, it refers to ways of thinking about and critiquing colonialism and its legacies. We have different studies in post-colonialism that rethink the way people are represented in history, especially those who were oppressed by colonial powers and different types of imperialism. It also considers how these oppressed people resisted their oppression and how colonial powers helped to shape the post-colonial societies that emerged after the withdrawal. In the post-colonial studies, reader, we have a scholar, Ashcroft, 2006, he noted that post-colonial is a resonate with all the ambiguity, complexity of the many different cultural experiences it implicates, and it addresses all aspects of colonial processes from the beginning of colonial contact. So colonialism, it explains the new phenomena from an understanding of colonialism. What are the influences of colonialism in a modern, free, independent state? So colonialism, it refers to the act of acquiring and setting up colonies. That's colonialism. Imperialism refers to the policy of forcefully imposing a country influence, customs, and power on a colonized country through military intervention or other means. Both imperialism and colonialism assumed many forms and impacted many diverse cultures, societies around the world. This means that the process of decolonization also assumed many forms. Post-colonialism now is the process of thinking through the political, cultural, and economic liberation that these movements set in place help to establish many of the principles of decolonization. These include, first of all, rewriting history to include the narratives of the colonized. For example, if it's in Africa, South Africa, including also the history of the natives. Colonial theories were written by the colonizers and commonly portrayed by the colonizer in heroic terms. While colonized people were often misrepresented and marginalized. For example, in the British colonies, the dominant narrative represented the British colonizer as heroes who brought civilization to primitive lands. The colonized native inhabitants of the country were, in contrast, portrayed as primitive and uncultured. So post-colonial writers and critics aim now to correct these narratives by emphasizing the importance of a diverse cultural identity. This helps them to challenge narratives that portray European culture as the pinnacle of civilization. Then finally, European colonizers often sought to erase indigenous cultures and languages in favor of their own. In post-colonial societies, nationhood and nationalism tend to be cultivated around patriotic ideas of nations' cultural, political, and social identity. Formerly oppressed people, they sought not only of the territorial boundaries and economic forms established by imperial powers, but also their culture, language, and history. One scholar told of in 2002, he identifies 4 common traits shared by former colonies in Africa that gained independence. Their stint under colonial rule was brief. It was brief in comparison to their pre-colonial history. They were all ruled by one of the European colonial powers. They were economically poor and dependent on exports to international markets. And they all sought to establish an independent identity as a nation state, the realization which was often complicated by the diversity of the population. Now, if we look at post-colonialism in South Africa, when thinking through the idea of post-colonialism in South African context, it is important first to understand what post-apartheid means. Apartheid in South Africa was a system of institutionalized racial segregation that defined the political and social landscape of the country from 1948 until the early 1990s. The historical institutions of apartheid and the transition to democracy that took place in 1995. 1994, it set South Africa apart from other African countries. Mzansi was the first colony to achieve independence from a European power. This was not, however, the end of the institutionalized colonial state. White minority rule continued, and it managed to persist through segregation legislation. After 1948, the ideology of segregation between the races was formally institutionalized as apartheid. In 1994, after years of liberation struggle and negotiations, Mzansi held its first democratic election. The ANC, the African National Congress, under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, took up governance of the country, instituted a new constitution, and officially ended apartheid. The period following the transition is referred to as post-apartheid. Hence, we say post-colonialism in South Africa after 1994, South Africa became known as the Rainbow Nation. This concept was created to represent the racial and cultural diversity of the country while simultaneously promoting unity. Hence, people born during or after 1994 became known as the born-free generation. These terms define the post-apartheid as an era free from oppression. However, in recent years, commentators, scholars, academics have shifted their focus from their ideal of post-apartheid unity to a more traditionally post-colonial interrogation of the contemporary moment. Rainbowism and narratives of unity through diversity are being challenged by referring to persistent racial discrimination, lingering colonial legacies, and questions about land ownership. Hence, we look at post-colonialism in culture as well. After we're looking at post-colonialism in South Africa, now let's look at post-colonialism in culture. The term culture is not easily defined because its meaning depends on context. Culture is socially constructed. It develops when a group of people live together and form beliefs or traditions, and it changes as those beliefs and traditions change. Two of the most important aspects of culture are the ability of human beings to construct, to build, and the ability to use language. Communication, invention, and reinvention are crucial to the formation of cultures. As we know by now that cultures are not static, but constantly changing. They are influenced by a particular socio-political movements in that time, but they are in turn also influence the material circumstances in which they are embedded. If we accept the idea that cultures are shaped by the circumstances which they emerge, then the concept of hybridity in post-colonial theory becomes a useful tool for thinking through the effect of colonialism on culture. In post-colonial discourse, hybridity commonly refers to the mixing of different cultures and the ways the Western culture have influenced Indian or African societies, or even sometimes vice versa. It is important to always remember that cultures are not static, but constantly changing. They're influenced by particular social political moments in time. That's very key to understand. And remember, South Africa is a country that was built through the hardships of violent struggle. And as South Africa made the transition to democracy, the idea of resistance and reinvention was central to emerging a new way of navigating an integrated racially and culturally diverse population. Then if you can also analyze post-colonialism in the globe, a global conversation about race and racial inequality is taking place not only in previously colonized countries, but also in the African diaspora, referring to people who have left their home countries and moved abroad, whether by choice or force. Then also you need to understand postmodernism theory, which refers to theoretical movement that originated in the 20th century. It is characterized by its interrogation of the established concept of reason. This is coupled to critique of ideology and the role that ideology plays in maintaining economic and political power. The lens through which people see the world is made up of a number of different aspects, including their culture, beliefs, and values. A critique of ideology looks at the ways in which these different elements are constructed or maintained. So postmodernism as a set of ideas is largely a reaction to the values and ideas of the modern period of Western and more specifically European history. The modern period occurs roughly from the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century to the mid-20th century. Remember now, postmodernism contextualization, we mean the term modern refers to many different periods throughout history and implies a construct between a recent period and an earlier period. Modernity implies progress, moving forward, and is most often associated with the 19th and 20th century world of politics, democracy, capitalism, and urbanization, mass literacy, mass media, and anti-traditionalism, and so on. So modern, the current definition refers to the current age, which is different from the historical period that has come before contemporary time or history. The progress made in the 19th and 20th century, social, political, and technological areas, for example, mass media, democracy, and capitalism. While modernism still believes in the value of rational thinking, science, and reason, postmodernism believed in the irrationality and incoherence of the everyday. Modernists advocated a distinction between high art and popular culture, while the postmodernism blurred the boundaries between what could and could not be considered art. In post-apartheid South Africa, postmodernist theory has proven useful in navigating new emerging cultural landscapes. Postmodernism recognized that the world is made up of multiple and diverse cultures and also promotes an increased awareness of the interest of the minority. Different groups, class struggle, and the drive toward both individual and group identities. So now the question becomes, what is the effect of postmodernism on culture? According to Erie 1990, in the postmodern moment, the function of culture evolved to occupy a more central position in the organization of present-day societies, whose contemporary culture can be at least in part of characterized as postmodernism. And postmodernism involves a dissolving of the boundaries, not only between high and low cultures, but also different cultural forms, such as tourism, art, education, photography, television, music, sport, shopping, and architecture. We can see here that culture is the postmodern sense that has a very broad and varied definition. The term culture can take on a number of meanings, like we discussed earlier on. It can refer to the knowledge and characteristics of specific groups of people, including their religion, social habits, language, music, and art. It can also refer to shared patterns of behavior, beliefs, and interactions that are formed through socialization. We also need to understand and analyze the effect of postmodernism on culture. While the early modern period was characterized by its promotion of a largely European idea of culture across the globe, postmodernism recognized multiculturalism, the idea that the world is made up of all kinds of cultures. In Mzansi, recognizing multiculturalism was an important step in dismantling the legacy of apartheid. In an attempt to show recognition for South Africa cultural diversity, the new government under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, they formally recognized 11 official languages: Zulu, Xhosa, Afrikaans, English, Sotho, Venda, Tswana, Tsonga, Pedi, Swati, and Ndebele. The move toward nation building was joined to the idea of multiculturalism and epitomized by the idea of rainbow nation. The idea of the rainbow nation is in many ways postmodern one, since it has always been hard to define, and like most postmodernism concept remains ambiguous. Hence now let's look at Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism is a cultural aesthetic as well as philosophy of science and history that seeks to investigate and explore the connections between Africa and African diaspora, culture, and technology. The Afrofuturistic aesthetic combines elements of science, fiction, Black history, and magic realism to investigate and interrogate both the contemporary moment and historical effects. In this sense, Afrofuturism combines both postmodern and post-colonial philosophies. Afrofuturism combines science fiction, technology, and culture to imagine a techno-African culture. Black Panther, which is a 2018 film based on the Marvel graphic novel and set in the fictional African nation of Wakanda. This film drew on Afrofuturism in its design and aesthetic. Let's look at post-structuralism. Post-structuralist thought is a reaction to liberal humanist ideas about the self. Your identity is fixed or rational. Post-structuralists reject the idea of the self as unified and whole, arguing that the self is constructed through different conversations with the surrounding world. Post-structuralists also deny the existence of human nature on an essential core, self, and argue that we only come to know and understand ourselves through the medium of language. Structuralism described the world in terms of structured logic. Structuralists viewed individual objects as inevitably belonging to a larger whole. Structuralism emphasized structures and processes that inform the construction of social reality and the way that we interact. Language was seen as the key to which allows us to unlock the creation and construction of meaning in our everyday lives. Meaning could be found within the text, which was by nature created in logical and unified manner. Structuralism is rule based on organized and attempts to apply a rational order to the world. However, post-structuralist thinkers challenged the idea that words have structured meanings. Jacques, he did this by suggesting that meaning could be found in the difference between concepts within the structure of language itself, and that this concept could contain multiple meanings. Post-structuralism rejects the structuralist idea of underlining and defined system that can explain how the world works. You look at post-structuralism in South Africa, the idea of the rainbow nation was popularized by Archbishop Desmond Tutu in 1994 to describe a newly formed democratic South Africa, characterized by its multicultural, multiracial, and multilingual social and political landscape. Post-structuralism challenges the idea that some narratives, such as the narrative of the rainbow nation, are more important or powerful than others, or that one story or description of another socio-political state is the true master narrative that defines everything. Now, let's look at post-feminism. The post-feminism is somewhat misleading, as it can suggest that feminist movements before the age of post-feminism had attained their goals of true economic, social, and political gender equality. However, the number of global movements that continue to fight for women's rights suggests that this is not the case. For example, the Me Too movement provokes conversations about sexual harassment and gender violence, about the fact that more South African women live in poverty than South African men, and that the reality that there is a lack of equal access to reproductive health care worldwide. Rather, the term post-feminism reflects a dissatisfaction with previous feminist movements as a myth designed to convince women of their freedom, when in reality there is still a lot to do in the fight of gender equality. Feminism has been described as happening in three waves. First wave, feminism occurred during the 19th and 20th century and was focused on legal and social issues within different societies. It was primarily a fight for women's right to vote and was therefore referred to as the women's suffrage movement. Notably, the movement was problematic in that it did not take into account the contentious race and class politics of the time. Then obviously the second wave feminism, which can be traced back to the period after the Second World War, focused on the workplace, sexuality, and reproductive rights. Although second wave feminism has been widely critiqued for its focus on predominantly white middle-class concerns, many women contributed to the second wave, also participants in the Black civil rights movement in the United States, together with other minority groups fighting for emancipation. Then the third wave of feminism began in the 1990s and arguably still in effect today. It's comprised of different feminist outlooks, including, for example, ecofeminism and intersectional feminism. Ecofeminism is a movement that draws connections between the exploitation of the Earth's natural resources and the exploitation of women. Intersectional feminism is a movement that argues for the recognition that different women experience different levels of expression, oppression in society, and that this difference is often determined by race, class, sexual, or a combination of these. Hence, post-feminism first appeared as a concept in the 1990s and has been described as marking a divide between old ways of thinking about women's rights and new ways of thinking about women's rights. In 1997, Annie Brooks writes that the term post-feminism can be understood as a useful conceptual frame of reference encompassing the intersection of feminism with a number of other anti-foundational movements, including postmodernism, post-structuralism, and post-colonialism. So the post-feminism movement is characterized as a strong independent characteristics that have found their way into marketing strategies in popular culture. Women are encouraged to associate certain brands or consumer goods with the characteristics of strong, independent women. According to Barnett Weisse, 2006, post-feminism boldly claims that women possess active political agents and subjectivity, yet the primary place in which these agents is recognized and legitimated is within individual consumption habits, as well as within general consumer culture. One of the effects of post-feminism is the media was the sexualization of culture, evident in a growing preoccupation with sexual practices and desires, identities, and the images of new types of sexual experiences. The idea of post-feminism appeared in the 1990s, a decade that also saw the transition of South Africa into a democracy and greater racial equality. Also included in the vision of the new South Africa was a move toward greater gender equality, reflected in the incorporation of key elements of the Women's Charter in the new South African Constitution and Bill of Rights. Now, we need to understand the signs. In as much as we discuss post-colonialism, what does Sassoon and arbitrary signs relate to media studies? Semiotics. As Sassoon tells us, the sign is composed of two parts, a signifier and a signified, as we have discussed earlier on. In this sense, language can no longer be understood through study of its linguistic origins, but rather it can be understood through different phenomena in media studies. If we talk of semiotics, we have Roland Barthes, who was a French literary critic, philosopher, linguistic, and semiotician. His ideas developed and influenced a number of fields, including structuralism, semiotics, and social theory. Although Barthes is, considered a structuralist following the theories of Ferdinand Saussure, some of his theories have also been classified as post-structuralist. Barthes views the sign, which is central to the study of semiotics, as something that conveys meaning, such as word, a symbol, or a myth. When studying the sign, how we interpret the sign, Barthes emphasizes the importance of not confusing culture on the naturalization of social habits with nature. In other words, we must consider the difference between the social construction of reality, things constructed by people, and material reality, things that exist as part of the world simply because they exist. We need to consider the two. A key aspect of Barthes' work and something that ties him to structuralism is his systematic approach to semiotics. He designed schemes and structures that could be used to divide up a text, myth, or narrative into different parts with different functions. Barthes is famous for a number of things, including his theories about the literature, art, culture, cultural life, many of which are still used today. For him, the term myth comes from the ancient Greek word mythos, which means idea, thought, or speech. When we think of myths in contemporary times, we think of fictional stories that contain monsters, gods, and supernatural forces. However, Roland Barthes believes a myth does not represent the natural state of the world. Rather, a myth represents the truth that the person telling the myth would like to convey. Fashion trends, for example, are often represented as natural rather than man-made. Then we look at denotation and connotation. A denotative statement is a first-order statement. Denotation can be described as the literal meaning of the statement or words. Connotation refers to the layers of meaning contained in the statement or word. By drawing on what the statement connotes, we can uncover its meaning. A sign is made up of a signifier and a signified. So simply put, the denotation is what the thing is, and the connotation is what it makes you think of. Connotations can vary according to different contexts and the different people interpreting the sign. For example, let's look at the image of olive branch. The denotation is that it is a branch from an olive tree. The connotative meaning of an olive branch is that it is a peace offering that resolves conflicts. Then Roland Barthes also analyzed advertising and was the first semiotician to draw attention to the importance of studying advertising and the media. His notion of denotation and connotation were used to show how advertising works by uncovering the advertisements could be read on two levels, a surface layer and underlying layer, the advertising as it is and the underlying meaning. Recently, for example, Absa Bank partnered with Advertising Essence, FCB Africa, to launch a new image for the bank through rebranding a new aesthetic. Part of the campaign, which appears in multiple television, radio, and online video advertisements, is the term Africanicity, defined as the distinctively African ability to always find ways to get things done. Absa is moved from European ownership to African ownership and decided to rebrand to reflect the change. The term Africanicity is a word made up by combining two other words, Africa and tenacity. So then, if we use Barthes' notions of denotation and connotation to analyze this word, we could draw the following conclusions. Number one, denotation. Africanicity is a nonsensical word that does not appear in the dictionary. It can't be found anywhere, but it's being presented in the same format as dictionary entry with a definition that reads the distinctively African ability to always find ways to get things done. Then we look at connotation, the representation of the word Africanicity, which is outlined as though it were in a dictionary, along with the pronunciation guidelines and definition. Ask us to accept it as real word made up of two recognizable words, Africa and tenacity. Africa is a continent in the southern hemisphere made up of a number of countries. Tenacity is a word that means determined or persistent. Combined with the proposed definition, we can then interpret the word Africanicity as the idea that people live on, come from the African continent, are unique and can get things done and are persistent and resilient. Therefore, Absa as an African bank is also unique in its ability to get things done and is persistent and resilient. In summary, when we talk of semiotics, we are saying human beings create, navigate, and make meaning in the world through language. Semiotics, or the study of science, is a field of scholarship that attempts to understand how and why we use language to communicate, construct, and navigate social reality. Structuralist and post-structuralist semiotic theories have become a significant part of media studies because they are useful for making sense of how the media is formed by and helps to form social reality. A sign is something that stands in for something, a reference, like what we discussed earlier on. A sign can be an image, a word or symbol of some kind that communicates meaning or is interpreted in a way that generates meaning. And remember what Roman Jacobson theories focused on verbal communication, but also could apply to ways that images and written text communication with a viewer or reader. He argued that communication was composed of 6 elements and 6 corresponding factors. Then we also analyzed Ferdinand de Saussure and Charles Sanders, who in terms of their approach to semiotics said the idea of duality or two-part system where the sign consists of 2 elements, a signifier and signified. The signifier refers to something that actually exists in material form, while the signified is the way that the signifier is interpreted. Then also we explored how Roland Barthes expands on all these theories to show how language and ideas operate in society and are socially constructed. This concept of the myth shows us how man-made ideas can be constructed in a way that makes them seem commonplace and natural to social interaction. Then we looked at South Africa and culture as well. The 1990s, pre-1994, post-1994. These are some of the things that we've discussed in week 9, week 10, and week